Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. We're so glad you joined us for the second session of our virtual discussion series, Equitable Implementation of Healthy Housing Policies. My name is Shaniqua Owusu, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ChangeLab Solutions. Before I hand it over to my colleague Wesley to kick us off for today's discussion, I wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce ChangeLab Solutions and this discussion series. ChangeLab Solutions is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that uses the tools of law and policy to advance health equity. We partner with communities across the nation to improve health and opportunity by changing harmful laws, policies, and systems. Our interdisciplinary team works with community organizations, governments, and local institutions to design and implement equitable and practical policy solutions to complex challenges. For more than 20 years at ChangeLab, we've been working alongside communities and local governments to help them create lasting change that will help all residents live a healthy life. We know all places are working to achieve equitable outcomes and struggling with how to do it. Here, we believe that laws and policies that have perpetuated racism, discrimination, and segregation throughout our nation's history have had and continue to have a profound effect on health and well-being. Our work focuses on addressing what we call the fundamental drivers of health inequity. Before you see this framework: structural discrimination and racism, income inequality, disparities in opportunity, disparities in political power, and governance that limits meaningful participation are all forces that create inequity and widen existing disparities. We outline this framework in our Blueprint for Changemakers, which is available on our website for anyone interested in diving deeper. Our virtual series on equitable implementation of healthy housing policies is intended to illustrate how strong housing policies paired with equitable implementation can support and promote health equity through access to affordable, healthy, safe, and stable housing. Each session will include panel-style discussions featuring community, local, and state leaders and stakeholders who will share examples of innovative policies and implementation strategies, as well as other insights rooted in their experiences. Some of you may have joined us last month when we kicked off the series with a conversation about housing justice and discussed equity considerations when it comes to housing code enforcement. If you were unable to join us for that session, you can now check out the recording on our website. Today, we're here to talk about tenant protections and how establishing a right to counsel for tenants can help governments equitably implement strategies to ensure that housing rights and protections are adequately enforced, and that laws that should be contributing to the health and safety and welfare of residents in their jurisdictions do so. So we hope that you will join us for our third and final session on November 29th. We've got a great lineup, and we'll be discussing capacity building for equitable implementation. With that, I want to thank you again for being here, and I'll pass it over to my colleague Wesley Hartman to get us started on the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shaniqua. My name is Wesley. I'm an attorney with ChangeLab. And just a few logistics and housekeeping first. I want to take a moment to say we're recording this event. It will be posted on the ChangeLab Solutions website, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording once it's ready. If you have questions for our panelists throughout today's discussion, please submit them through the Q&A box. My ChangeLab colleagues and I will be monitoring incoming questions. We'll answer some in writing and flag some for discussion with the panel later. Last, the chat function for this webinar is open, so we'd invite you to share comments or reactions along the way and engage with your fellow attendees. And with that, we'll dive in. As we discussed during our first session, there are nationwide challenges with affordable housing given record high inflation, significant job losses, wage stagnation, low rates of home construction, and rising rents. Further, about 6 million homes in the United States are considered to present health and safety dangers to their occupants. There are also significant housing challenges in terms of eviction and displacement. Researchers estimate that on average, over 3.6 million evictions are filed in the United States every year. While local, state, and federal housing laws and policies provide a variety of protections that can support housing stability and protect tenants from displacement, as with many other laws, there is a significant gap between the promise of those laws and people's lived experience. This gap exists in part because laws often are not implemented equitably. Like our previous session discussing the use of proactive rental inspection to improve equitable enforcement of housing code systems, our conversation today will focus on equitable implementation of law and policies that protect tenants through the use of right to counsel. So before our panel, I'll talk a little more about what we mean by equitable implementation, discuss some of the health impacts of evictions and related housing issues, and introduce right to counsel as an equitable implementation strategy to improve housing and health outcomes. So as we've said, law and policy contribute to health disparities, but law and policy can also be used as a tool to help improve health equity. Equitable implementation is the process of ensuring that laws and policies are developed, enforced, and evaluated while considering and minimizing harms to underserved communities. An equitable implementation approach considers equity through all stages of planning, development, design, and enforcement, including meaningful participation and community engagement with impacted populations. It's also important to know that this is a continuous process. Laws and policies need to be monitored and evaluated over time, with ongoing adjustments made to ensure they're having an equitable impact and helping to achieve greater health equity. To put equitable implementation in context, we'll consider this example from Seattle, Washington. So in a more equitable system, eviction rates might be the same regardless of race, income, or location. But in 2020, researchers with the University of Washington and University of California, Berkeley determined that in many places in Seattle, women were more often evicted than men, and Black and Latina households were evicted more often than white households. The researchers posited this was a result of multiple factors, including limited availability of affordable housing, rising rents, and the rent burden on Black and Latina households in particular due to systemic discrimination driving lower household incomes. As shown in the map on the screen, in some counties, the highest risk of eviction occurred in formerly redlined neighborhoods, demonstrating the idea that inequitable implementation can compound through different policies over time. Inequitable implementation of housing finance, investment, and property laws led to disinvested communities, which today contribute to the burden of eviction. Inequitable implementation of housing laws and tenant protections can also have significant impacts on community health through pathways such as housing safety and housing stability, or the ability to stay in place without being forced to move. For example, substandard conditions such as water leaks, poor ventilation, dirty carpets, and pest infestation have been associated with poor health outcomes, most notably those related to asthma. Additionally, people who are chronically unhoused face substantially higher morbidity in terms of both physical and mental health and increased mortality. Evictions themselves worsen mental health by increasing stress, anxiety, and depression. They can result in overcrowding or unstable housing longer term, and they're associated with other poor health outcomes, including increased emergency department utilization, higher risk of disease transmission, difficulty accessing and maintaining access to care, and even exposure to violence. There is also often interplay between evictions and other housing quality challenges. For example, collective organizing efforts, requests for repairs, and code enforcement complaints may put a household at risk of a retaliatory eviction by their landlord. Tenants may also try to withhold rent if their landlord fails to make needed habitability repairs, and then have to fight an eviction case because of their non-payment. And finally, many tenants in eviction cases may be living in substandard conditions, especially given that low-income households are both more likely to face eviction and also more likely to live in housing with health-harming hazards. So what is right to counsel, and why are we discussing it in this context? Well, broadly, right to counsel refers to a law that provides a guarantee to full representation by an attorney in a legal case, regardless of ability to pay. As you likely know, the Supreme Court has long held that criminal defendants have a right to be provided an attorney at state expense if they can't afford one, when cases can result in imprisonment. There is no corresponding federal right to counsel in civil cases as opposed to criminal cases. However, civil cases involve high stakes that arguably rival those in criminal cases, including the potential loss of shelter and evictions, custody of children, public benefits and access to healthcare, physical safety, and even liberty. In this gap, every state has taken steps to guarantee a right to counsel in at least one type of civil case, most often family law cases, appointing counsel to parents in termination of parental rights cases, or to youth who are involved in foster care or going through child custody proceedings. But legal representation is not guaranteed in the vast majority of civil cases across the country. Several groups and coalitions are working to fill this gap and argue that representation should be guaranteed in many types of civil cases, such as those involving basic human needs, if not all types of civil cases. In the housing context, right to counsel is often talked about in terms of right to counsel in eviction proceedings, although you can imagine a right to counsel in any number of housing cases involving tenant protections, such as habitability and safety. Focusing on eviction for now, right to counsel seeks to guarantee representation for tenants facing eviction, usually when their landlord has filed a lawsuit asking the court to permit the tenant's eviction from their home. And this is incredibly important because on average, 83% of landlords are represented compared to just 4% of tenants. The movement to establish a right to counsel for tenants has seen significant progress in recent years. There's been a long history of academic advocacy efforts and pilot programs that culminated in New York City passing the first right to counsel law in 2017. As of now, there are 4 states, 1 county, and 17 cities that have also enacted right to counsel laws. Some of the main arguments in favor of right to counsel include the items we've already discussed today, including the health consequences and costs of eviction, as well as the racial and gender disparities in eviction cases. And evidence shows that right to counsel is highly effective. In jurisdictions where it's been implemented, anywhere from about 60% to well over 90% of tenants represented during their eviction proceedings have not been involuntarily displaced, which comes with all the associated health benefits of housing stability. While right to counsel is one tool to help ensure equitable implementation of other laws, an equitable implementation lens can also be applied to right to counsel programs themselves. In order to help ensure right to counsel is implemented equitably, localities can use a number of different strategies, and these strategies can also be applied to any number of other housing laws and tenant protections. These include involving affected communities and groups in the design, implementation, and administration of housing law and policy, changing the culture of enforcement away from finding violations and enacting punitive measures toward prioritizing housing stability, community health, and equity, developing cross-sector or interagency coordination and partnerships. So in this context, how are tenants, legal and social services providers, the courts, and others working together to implement right to counsel? And last, mitigating harm for displaced communities. So recognizing that all displacement might not be stopped, what other supports are in place to help tenants that are forced to move or to help address the circumstances that led to the eviction proceeding in the first place. Whether you're hoping to create a right to counsel program in your jurisdiction or considering the equity implications of an existing program, this raises a number of different questions, some of which we'll continue to discuss with our panelists. For example, what is the strength of underlying housing rights? Because representation can only enforce the rights that exist. Who is eligible for programs? everyone or just a subset of the population based on income or eviction risk in their neighborhood? And finally, when does the right to counsel attach and in what types of cases? By that, we mean, when do tenants connect with counsel? Is it on the day of the hearing at the courthouse? Are they able to connect and benefit from representation in advance? And does that representation apply to related issues like housing, habitability, and safety in addition to the eviction itself? If you want to learn more about equitable implementation, please see the resources available on our website, including a guide to equitable enforcement, a comprehensive guide to proactive rental inspection programs and model proactive rental inspection ordinance, which were covered during our first session, as well as other housing and good governance resources. We're also aiming to publish on right to counsel. We, along with our partners at the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel, Human Impact Partners, PolicyLink, and Results for America, are currently working on a right to counsel primer for public health professionals that will be released early next year. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Melissa, for our panel.
Thank you, Wesley, for that great presentation. And hello, everyone. I am really thrilled to introduce you to our wonderful panelists today, Zach Hale, Hugo Ramirez, and John Pollock. Zach is a group representation specialist and senior staff attorney at Brooklyn Legal Services Corporation A, where he works with tenant associations to enforce their rights to safe, healthy, and affordable housing through a mix of organizing and affirmative litigation, and represents individual tenants facing eviction proceedings through New York City's Right to Counsel program. He also advocates for tenant-centered policy reform as co-chair of the Brooklyn Tenant Lawyers Network. Hugo is the Community Development Program Manager at the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, where he leads San Francisco's anti-displacement strategies, including San Francisco's Tenant Right to Counsel program, as well as other community-based strategies, including tenant rights education, outreach and counseling, and financial assistance programs. And finally, John is the coordinator of the National Coalition for the Civil Right to Counsel, as well as a staff attorney for the Public Justice Center. As coordinator of the National Coalition, he leads the coalition's work at the state and local level to establish the right to counsel for low-income individuals in civil cases involving basic human needs. So in short, as you can gather from all these incredible pieces of information about their work, these panelists bring so much experience to the conversation. It's a real treat to hear from them. So we'll pull the slides and get into the conversation. I'll also flag before we get started that a lot of the information about existing right to counsel programs can be found on the website for the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel at civilright2counsel.org. Okay, and with that, let's get started and dive into the conversation. So John, I thought that maybe you could kick us off by telling us a little bit more about the movement to establish a right to counsel for tenants and why these laws are important. What should government officials and advocates thinking about healthy housing and health equity know about right to counsel?
Thanks, Melissa, and it's a pleasure to be here today. Wesley did a great job of laying out the picture for right to counsel, but one of the things that's really tricky about this issue is that a lot of people think the right to counsel already exists for people even in eviction cases. They've seen Law and Order and other shows where they've seen people being given a warning. If you can't afford a lawyer, one will be given to you. And they think that that's already in place, which is why the first step is to make even people aware of what the current law is. And as Wesley said, there's no federal right to counsel in civil cases. The states have actually done quite a lot on their own to step in, either under their statutes or even under court decisions about constitutional rights to counsel The states have all established a right to counsel for certain kinds of civil cases, but it's a patchwork. There's no state that guarantees a right to counsel for all civil cases. There are some that guarantee them for very few kinds of cases. And we actually have all of that outlined on our website. We have a map that shows, if you are interested, you can look by subject area. It'll show you the status across all 50 states and the source of those laws and more details on them. So the question is, why right to counsel? And I think specifically, why right to counsel for housing cases? Well, the intro laid out some of the most important points, and where we start when we consider a right to counsel is what's at stake. And one of the reasons why we focus on housing so much is because housing is essentially a fracture point where you lead to all sorts of other deprivations if that initial deprivation happens. I think everyone understands that, your home is the place of safety, of sanctuary, of gathering with your family. That part I think is understood, but the consequences of what happens to someone if they get evicted, homelessness is, well-established connection between eviction and homelessness. And when people are homeless, they're subject to arrest, incarceration, serious health consequences for living on the street. That part, again, I think homelessness is often, fairly understood that can be a consequence of eviction. But what about the people who aren't homeless? There are tons of consequences that are visited on those families. And those include some of the things that were mentioned in the intro. Loss of child custody, because a family doesn't have a stable home anymore. Loss of children's education because their children can't stay in the same school district. Loss of employment for the same reason. People forced to move so far away from their employment locations, they can't afford the transportation, so they lose access. And health. The serious health consequences of losing an eviction, even an eviction filing, the data has shown actually causes harm to tenants, just being subjected to the eviction process, even if the eviction is dismissed. And losing an eviction, getting that on your record, puts you in a place where the only housing you'll be able to get, if any, is going to be the most substandard, the most hazardous housing out there. So basically, the health consequences are extreme and compounded again by all of these other sort of consequences that go along with it. We also care about this issue because of race equity. We know, and these are some statistics that just came out, that Black Americans make up only 18.6% of all renters, but accounted for 51.1% of those threatened with eviction and 43% of those who are evicted. That is a huge disparity, like absolutely massive when you try to consider how to get your head around that level of disparity. And also children. Right now, we know from the data that children under 5 make up the largest group by age of those whose household have had an eviction against them. So we're dealing with questions of race equity, of family stability. The data is irrefutable that shows that's who is at risk in these proceedings. We also care because of the imbalance of power. Our statistics show that about 4% of tenants nationally have access to counsel compared to about 82% of landlords. So that is a huge, almost unimaginable disparity in housing court. And it's not hard to imagine when the tenants almost never have a lawyer and the landlords always do, what a housing court is going to behave like. It basically often is very much tailored to the needs of the landlord, sort of ensuring that they're getting what they need in the process, that it goes quickly. The tenants who try to object often may not even get a chance to speak. They may not even be allowed to. They're coerced into sort of settling quickly. We know from some of the data that some of these proceedings last less than 60 seconds. That's exactly the kind of thing that happens because there's no lawyer on the tenant side. And we also know that right to counsel is critical to building tenant power, for tenants to feel empowered, not just for the eviction, but even outside of the eviction proceeding, to know, well, I can actually try to enforce my housing rights and not have to worry that I'm going to be evicted as a result, which is especially like if you talk about health. For a lot of tenants, they're worried if they complain about repairs and other things that they're going to get evicted as a result. So this is a direct connection that tenants make between housing, health, and right to counsel. And that sort of leads in again also to enforcement of other housing laws, which we're going to talk about later. But, basically to say that one thing we've seen is that some of the most really effective housing laws have not succeeded where there's no counsel to actually help the tenants bring those claims. The tenants don't know how to do them. The laws are not designed in a way necessarily to be completely effective without a legal representative. They still need someone who understands the parameters of that law, what the requirements are to make the case for it, how to defend against counter arguments, and so on. And just one, data point I like to make on this is that during the pandemic, we saw the federal government passed a moratorium on evictions, not the CDC one that everyone remembers where tenants had to file an affidavit. But before that, there was a previous one under the CARES Act that said that tenants who were in federally subsidized housing were automatically protected from eviction, even a filing. Landlords were prohibited from taking any step whatsoever against a tenant who was in federally subsidized housing. They did not have to file an affidavit. They did not have to make a defense. They did not have to do anything to be protected. And yet we saw during the pandemic that hundreds and hundreds of landlords violated that moratorium and filed evictions anyway against the tenants. And those tenants were evicted because there was no gatekeeping. There was no process for identifying those. And the tenants themselves did not know about the law or whether it applied to them. So it just goes to show that even when you try to make a law, what we call self-executing, where someone doesn't need an attorney, we still find that that's a necessary piece. And we actually saw that with rental assistance as well, that, while rental assistance was designed to basically just be a solution to a non-payment case during the pandemic, that even there were many cases where the tenants couldn't get into the rental assistance program, or the landlords refused to accept rental assistance, or they did accept it and then immediately turned around and evicted the tenant as soon as they got it. All of these problems showed that you needed this sort of parallel between right to counsel and other laws. And the last piece, or the last two things I'll mention, are that we know from decades of evidence that right to counsel works. Like we have had studies after study after study that says when tenants receive full representation, they don't get evicted as often, their records are cleaner, they have longer term housing stability. We do that before right to counsel. And since it's passed, the data emerging from jurisdictions like New York City, 84% of the tenants remaining in their homes. In San Francisco, it's almost 60%. In Cleveland, 93% of the tenants are avoiding involuntary move or displacement. So like we're seeing just dramatic results coming from the program. And that's part of what convinces places to do this. And the last part is cost savings. We've had study after study after study look at the cost of right to counsel compared to the benefits from not paying for things like having to pay so much for shelters and foster care and emergency medical care and all of these other things that cities and states pay for and counties pay for because people are getting unnecessarily evicted. And the studies have shown that right to counsel pays for itself many times over compared to all of those external costs. So where we are, as the slide showed at the beginning, 22 jurisdictions, we have 17 cities, 4 states, 1 county that have a right. That's just in 6 years. We were, before 2017, not one jurisdiction had a right. Since 6 years, we've seen this many pass it. And we're in conversations with another, I would say, to 40 to 50 places that are in the conversation about right to counsel, some of which are very, very close to passage at this point. So there's going to be more, even potentially by the end of this year, let alone in the coming years. So this is a movement I think that people see as essential, as one that is working, and one that is also essentially becoming mainstream. Like there's data now that show that public support for right to counsel is really high, even across the political spectrum. This is no longer like a left-right, divide issue. Like there's general public support for the concept of a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. So I think all of that together is why cities and states and counties have been embracing the right to counsel.
Thank you so much, John, for those really helpful data points and outlining the argument for why we should be thinking about right to counsel. And I'd like to turn us to thinking about what are the actionable steps for policymakers, public health professionals on the call that are interested in moving this forward in their jurisdiction. Ugo, you've been overseeing the implementation of San Francisco's tenant right to counsel law, which was adopted by ballot measure in 2018, becoming the second tenant right to counsel law to be adopted in the US. Can you tell us more about how you're partnering with legal service providers to increase housing stability and what implementation of right to counsel has looked like in your jurisdiction?
Absolutely. Well, our tenant right to counsel is the result of years of hard work and innovation of San Francisco's tenant advocacy and legal aid communities. There have been various iterations since 2012, and culminating in this gold standard of our tenant right to counsel program that the city fully funds today, $17 million annually. And every iteration has been meaningful. So I encourage those in attendance today to not be discouraged when thinking about what your communities can do to promote the health and well-being of your residents through stable housing. Be bold, but start small if necessary. So as you alluded to earlier, Melissa, San Francisco really provides a full spectrum of community-based anti-displacement services. We have our tenants' rights, counseling, education, outreach, organizing. We have a strong mediation partnership with the local bar association. We have various financial assistance programs, and we have a robust tenant right-to-counsel program that really, as John so eloquently, beautifully presented, really hits on all of those things. Black and brown residents, extremely low income, very low income households, long-term rent control tenants, they're all overrepresented in our eviction legal defense. Our eviction system. But our eviction legal defense system, the tenant right to counsel, really gets compelling results for all of them. In San Francisco, the legal process is not as lopsided as it was. John alluded to how essential having kind of that safety net infrastructure was during the pandemic, where all of these potential defenses for tenants and protections were actually implemented, actually took place in San Francisco because we had such a strong tenant right to counsel program that was able to gatekeep, quarterback, whatever term you want to use, our financial assistance interventions, our local and state eviction moratoria, et cetera. And then also from the court's perspective, right? So I'm with the city and county of San Francisco. We have, our board of supervisors is our little legislature. We have the mayor's office, a strong mayor, Mayor London Breed, our executive, right? But then we also have the Superior Court of California, a separate co-equal branch of government, right? And for them, San Francisco's Superior Court, for them, our program represents more efficient court operations, a better experience for all of its litigants, right? So there's also in San Francisco, our program coordinates with the court's operations, as John alluded to. Self-represented litigants, it is incredibly traumatic and difficult to navigate the legal process. It's scary. I mean, it's a lawsuit, right? And so much is at stake. So I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity to highlight these different strategies and the outcomes that we're seeing in San Francisco. But yeah, our tenant right to counsel program that was enacted before the pandemic really enabled us to stabilize the housing of our residents during the worst of the pandemic.
Thank you, Hugo. I'm just so thrilled that our audience is hearing from you and John, and I'd like to also turn to Zach. Thinking about who's on the call right now, we have a lot of public health officials, a lot of departments that are tasked with enforcing housing habitability laws. So I was wondering, Zach, you've written about how government agencies and courts can be slow to require landlords to make essential repairs, and I know that you're working with tenant associations on some of these issues. So could you share a little bit about how you think right to counsel can support tenants in exercising their rights to habitable housing, and what else we can be doing to support them?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question, and thank you to my co-panelists and to Change Lab Solutions for putting this on. We've already heard so much useful, helpful, encouraging information. The role of a traditional right to counsel in eviction defense also is significant for helping tenants to enforce their rights to habitability and to rely on the background rights that may be embodied in building code or maintenance code or health codes. As John was mentioning before, and the tenant right in many jurisdictions to maybe withhold rent or to have their rent abated due to conditions in their apartment, essentially requires either, a highly specialized court administration process whereby they can prove what the conditions were and that they were withholding, or that, how it normally happens, it leads to an eviction lawsuit in which those, especially in New York, this is how it happens where I practice, where those conditions create a defense. And so right to counsel, one of its great strengths in the courtroom itself is having somebody who can assert defenses, right? And counterclaims. So a counterclaim, again, it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction how these things work, but you might be able to have an active counterclaim against the landlord in some jurisdictions where you're asserting your rights to healthy, habitable housing. So the defensive role of the right to counsel attorney allows for those rights to be litigated, enforced, and for those tenants to improve their conditions. And my practice as a group representation specialist, I also focus on something that's outside of a traditional right to counsel role, but we also have a program here in New York that funds attorneys to do affirmative litigation. It's a separate process from right to counsel, but there's a lot of overlap in the work, and you're going to the same housing court, often in front of the same judges. And what you're doing is you're asserting under the rights of the code, right? So the housing maintenance code and the department code, you are working in tandem with, and frankly, sometimes against, adversarially, the agencies who are in charge of enforcement, to work out the enforcement of these codes for the benefit of renters. So those often, the lines within the programming at the funding level are distinct, but the lines in practice are very blended, because healthy housing is an issue that precedes eviction a lot of times. And what I mean by that is that, what leads to before you get to a court case, you can have the deleterious kind of neglectful conditions in the apartment that in some cases, the property owner may be hoping to avoid the expenses of court cases by just having the person self-evict, right? And I don't even think that's right, because it's not self-eviction, right? It's still on a spectrum of eviction. It's a form of, forced relocation on behalf of the landlord to say, I'm going to disinvest. So often that's framed as a cost-saving measure, but it's also, in my practice, I often litigate that as a form of harassment or eviction. So just to one more point on this, so the role of right to counsel is very helpful in asserting those rights, but also thinking about the structure of the court process and the availability of the assertion of those defenses is very important. For example, in the right to counsel programs in New York, and I know that in general, evictions are often these summary proceedings that move quickly, and the ability to gather evidence related to, you've limited discovery rights and limited process in those ways. So your ability to gather and present the evidence, obviously tenants are their own best advocates, but many times, if they haven't had an attorney working with them up until the case, they may not have preserved all of the evidence, or they may have gone about things in a more casual way. Casual is maybe not the right term, but not formalized the way that an attorney would know how to record communications and document conditions. And so to expand the idea that attorneys and right to counsel and tenant representation can also really strengthen habitability laws, we also have to think about the role of tenant advocates outside of the courtroom before litigation, and their ability to do everything from know your rights trainings to actually working with community organizers to bolster before litigation the tenant's ability to build that case either defensively or affirmatively.
And if I can just add something to that, that's such a great point that, we always have to be looking upstream, like with every intervention. When you look at homelessness, the goal is to intervene earlier with eviction. And when you're looking at eviction, the goal is to intervene earlier so that you don't wind up in eviction in the first place. And one of the things that's important for us as right to counsel advocates, even though this is what we do, we don't believe that this is the solution to everything. It isn't. It is a part of the solution, and it's important to recognize it as such. It's not the thing that will fix the entire eviction crisis. It's a part of the puzzle, and it has to be done in parallel with other interventions in the eviction process, and then as well as other interventions further upstream to address affordable housing, to address housing conditions. Like these are bigger pieces that can then also, in fact, reduce the pressure on right to counsel, because you won't have so many people feeding into the system in the first place. So sometimes we can be perceived as, we're obviously very zealous advocates for right to counsel, but we don't want to oversell it. It is part of a larger reform picture.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Zach. The partnerships and moving upstream is so important to highlight. We can't forget about that. And I think that also leads me to want to circle back to Ugo and your work implementing right to counsel in San Francisco, because you've mentioned that you're also overseeing other anti-displacement programs, and I know your colleagues in other offices are also working on innovative code enforcement practices. But we also know that there's other jurisdictions that may not have many or any of these anti-displacement programs in place just yet. What advice do you have for those officials who are just getting started and may not have any supports yet in place?
Yeah, well, I should elaborate a little more on kind of the context in San Francisco, right? So as John alluded to earlier, we have a 40-year-old rent control and just cause ordinance, which again is just part of the context in San Francisco. What I oversee and what our community-based organizations implement are really the community-based services. So it's really the safety net. The Tenant right-to-counsel program, the services are delivered by 8 legal services organizations led by a legal service organization called the Eviction Defense Collaborative. Our program has both centralized referral there at EDC, the Eviction Defense Collaborative, and no wrong door, right? So if a tenant goes to any other legal services organization, they will be referred to an attorney there as well. And I also alluded to this full spectrum of services that begins with building tenant power. We have just as many tenant advocacy organizations in San Francisco that have been working, for example, to enact that rent ordinance that provides rent control and just cause protections for tenants, constantly amending it to be more protective. They also provide direct services in terms of providing counseling around habitability and rent increases and other tenant landlord matters. They collaborate with the staff attorneys of the Tenant Right to Counsel program. So it's a really vital ecosystem of tenant serving organizations. And then we have financial assistance that's really appropriate at any intervention, right? There are many structural problems. One of which is income inequality and housing unaffordability, and financial assistance kind of solves for that in a safety net sense. But going back to your initial question, Melissa, in San Francisco, something else that I'm really proud of is that homelessness prevention, which is out of our Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing, and anti-displacement, my department, the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, work hand in hand in terms of funding these programs, designing these programs, and in some cases even jointly administering these programs, like our emergency rental assistance program. So that I would consider as a best practice. We've gotten results here in San Francisco with that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, be bold and start small if necessary. There have been many iterations since 2012 and before, right? So our Tenant Right to Counsel was enacted through a 2018 ballot measure, but there were years of work, decades, when you consider the building of tenant power that was necessary to create those conditions. So you can't go wrong supporting tenants unions or other community-based organizations that work with tenants and workers in building their rights. You cannot go wrong with that. You cannot go wrong with an intentional legal intervention from your legal aid sector in terms of, in San Francisco, for example, we had a universal program that predates the right to counsel. And it was just to ensure that a tenant got their day in court. It was as simple as that. Right here in California, a landlord files that lawsuit at court. The tenant is served with that lawsuit. They have 5 court days to respond to it. Otherwise, they automatically lose. Right. So years ago, our universal program was just to make sure we have a clearinghouse, a legal services organization that helps tenants provide that initial response, just so that they get their day in court. And then that became, let's hire more staff attorneys. Let's provide more full scope legal representation. And then it became this ballot initiative, this massive campaign that tenant organizers led. And it resulted in this tenant right to counsel as the local law of the land. I'd be happy to talk about the funding side of it because it was kind of an unfunded mandate. And I'm sure a lot of government officials on the call can relate to the difficulty of implementing an unfunded mandate. But yes, I would say you can't go wrong with supporting community-based organizations that serve tenant, no matter how they serve them, and then an intentional partnership with your legal aid community to make sure that people have access to justice in this high-stakes environment of housing.
Thank you. And I do want to circle back in a few minutes to the question and challenge of funding. But on this topic of centering tenants impacted by eviction, I'm wondering about intentional ways we can build processes to center the tenants impacted most by eviction, Black and Brown tenants, in both the campaigns to implement these types of laws and also in implementing them and evaluating them. John, maybe you have some suggestions for us?
Well, I think the first thing is just even accepting that premise, that tenants have to be at the center of the movement. In some places, that's not necessarily a given. And one of the challenges can be that other actors, and that can be legal aid, that can be the city government, may have a very strong sense of how they should do things or what is best politically, what will work most smoothly, et cetera. And there may be a feeling that tenant organizers will upset the apple cart or make it too difficult or something along those lines. And, our response to that is they have to be included. You cannot do this without them. They are the ones for whom you are doing this in the first place. You may not find their tactics or their strategies to be the ones that you would use, but to basically say, we're going to do this without your involvement, it doesn't make any sense. They're the ones you're doing it for. So, a lot of times the first step is to just even get that buy-in that tenants should be involved in the political process and in the implementation. So that's really like step one. And the best way to do that, again, is, and what we do, we consult on all of these campaigns around the country. We were involved in all the ones that have passed so far and all the ones that are in the works. And the first thing we do is when we get a call from the mayor's office or the city council or a legal aid program, and we say, where is your tenant organizing? Sometimes the answer is we don't have any, there is no tenant organizing group in the city or the county or whatever. And then the response to that is it doesn't have to be a tenant organizing group. There are plenty of organizing groups out there that are interested and care about right to counsel. The Democratic Socialist chapters all over the country have been heavily involved in right to counsel passage. They were instrumental in Boulder. They were heavily involved in San Francisco, in Connecticut, in Jersey City, in getting these ordinances enacted. So they were another group. Like the AFL-CIO is another group that's often interested in this issue, or unions in general. Black Lives Matter. There are lots of different organizing groups that see this issue as one they want to take on. So basically, it's really getting that map, that really stakeholder mapping of who is in our community that is interested in this issue, that works at a grassroots community level, and what do they want to see. And another part of that is that we've seen that really helps with effectiveness is not to go to a tenant group and say, hey, we've got this all mapped out. Do you want to add your name to this as a signatory, or do you want to be a supporter? That's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is basically for them to be there at step one, basically when the planning first begins for the idea of a right to counsel, to say, who should it cover? What are the priorities? Like, what role do we roll this out? How are we going to decide who goes first? How are we going to do the most effective outreach? Like, those things, they don't need to be consulted. They need to be like the leaders and the partners of those efforts. And so again, it's a lot of that is changing the mindset of the way that people think about using tenant organizing in this work. It's not borrowing their assistance. It's making them the center of the movement. And as I wrote in the chat, what we've seen is that the strongest ordinances, the ones with the best language, the ones that have had the best implementation post enactment, are the ones with the tenant groups are being involved in that work. In fact, in New York City, they passed a law that requires the city to work with tenant organizers. That was a law that was passed several years after the initial law was passed. And, that's what we want to see more and more of, is in the law itself, that's built into the structure of the ordinance, that tenant, advisory committees, that tenant oversight, that's part of the law, not an afterthought, but actually part of the structure of how the program's built.
Definitely. And that is an additional resource to check out. The prior jurisdictions that have passed this law, look at their language, look at how they're potentially including oversight bodies that include or require tenants. And I'm wondering, Zach, if you have any other suggestions on this topic, because I know that you are thinking a lot about how to center tenants in policy reform.
Yeah, thank you. I think John just really described both the stakes and the methods very well. In my experience, when I'm working with groups of tenants, tenant movements, and tenant organizers, we are, seeking to then further enact more tenant protections, right? Looking at the good cause fight and things like that, and looking to strengthen the tenant movement's position going forward. So I have to say, and this is, I'll be echoing some of what we've already heard today, but the baseline right to counsel, or even pre-right to counsel, Ugo was talking about some of these initial steps that can take place. Those are the scaffolding on which the tenant movement builds, consolidates power, and then can see a path forward. And so I think that the existence of representation, so I began practicing here in Brooklyn in 2019. So the right to counsel in New York was a couple of years old. It was still being rolled out by zip code. And being part of the expansion, I've seen the way that the expansion of the availability of counsel has allowed the imagination and the vision of the movement to gain brightness and clarity, and to really be able to say, well, now that we know, hopefully, as long as the processes and funding stay in place, that at this baseline we can do things like go on a rent strike, right? And we're going to be able to access defenses. So then how do we move on to the next thing? And I think while maintaining our advocacy, we still have to fight for RTC funding every cycle. So that's important to not lose sight of that, as in anything. But as John was saying, and I know the Right to Counsel coalition here in New York has a great toolkit that talks a lot about kind of the stages that go through, and to continually ground yourself being, if you're doing policy work and it's more of a top down, continually wanting to recenter the voices, the visions of those who are most impacted by the housing crisis, the renters themselves, their families, sometimes even just having a venue to hear the stories is surprisingly rare, right? In the policy making process, often individual experiences and anecdotes get kind of aggregated, and we look at a lot of just kind of data, but to make sure that, there can be, there's room for testimony, and the recording and speech act of describing the actual conditions of renting, I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of that to the success of a program. And as John also said in the chat and in his speech about it, the buy-in, right? The level of trust that the community has in the program and in the movement as it interfaces with government, right? And that just, it's a wheel, and you want the wheel to keep turning. And so anyway, that's basically my experience with it. And I am every day so impressed and in awe of the tenants that I work with, and their tenacity, their resilience, and it keeps me going. I know that as well.
Thank you, Zach. I think that really reflects how I felt when I was working on the coalition in Connecticut, getting tenants into these spaces where tenants' experiences aren't necessarily really ever talked about in human terms, and what this actually means for families is really huge, and it doesn't actually require such large changes. It perhaps just include some planning and logistics to get some of those voices in the conversation, and then we can build in those processes to make that more systematic. Last question. Obviously, right to counsel is proposing a large systems change, and it requires serious funding. It requires infusion of skilled attorneys. Ugo, going to turn it back to you. What are your recommendations? What's going on in San Francisco?
Well, to echo what Zach and you just shared, Melissa, helping and learning from tenants brings me joy. Helping and learning from our staff attorneys and other staff brings me joy. And helping and learning from colleagues brings me joy. So I really encourage folks to reach out. Shout out to Jordan Dressler in New York City. I remember years ago, he was a huge resource to me as San Francisco was standing up its program. I've been a resource to my colleagues in LA and other communities, including small communities. And that's how it works. John's been a resource throughout. So pipeline. That's what New York City experienced. That's what San Francisco experienced. John, correct me if I'm wrong. Every community will experience that because that's a sector problem, right?
Yeah, I was just starting to type an answer to that in the Q&A that, we're seeing a problem with what's called the pipeline, meaning attorneys available to take these jobs, not just in right to counsel, but civil legal aid generally is having this, and even indigent defense. This is a national big problem.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right? You have people who go to law school and accrue a lot of debt, student debt, to become attorneys. And then public interest law isn't super lucrative, right? And so people have to eat, especially in San Francisco, or we're a little expensive, to live in. So our brilliant legal aid leaders are providers of our Tenant Right to Counsel program. And we at the city designed a fellows program to kind of build that pipeline. And so what that entails is basically recruiting 3Ls, while they're still in law school, providing financial help and mentorship to them as they prepare to pass the bar. And it's not working for free. It's providing them the financial assistance and mentorship so that they could focus just on studying for the bar so that they pass it. And then once they pass it, they'll have a job all ready for them. And the Tenant Right to Counsel in San Francisco kind of changed that job market too, because it's so well funded by the city that, attorneys here that were earning perhaps, $55,000 per year are now earning 70 or more, in terms of entry level attorneys. So even the job market changed, the sector changed in San Francisco, but it's still a big challenge for us. We're fully funded, and we have about 50 amazing eviction defenders, tenant right attorneys, but we still need a handful more in order to provide full scope to everyone who's entitled to it. So that fellowship program, shout out to Laura Chiara, Legal Assistance to the Elderly, to our brilliant director of litigation and policy of our program, Ora Prochovnik at the Eviction Defense Collaborative, and others for designing such a badass program that's really building that pipeline. In terms of funding, like, listen, y'all, yes, San Francisco uses its general fund to pay for it. It also uses its community development block grant program, CDBG. Y'all have CDBG. Like, even small governments have CDBG. And this is like a slam dunk program for CDBG public services. Additionally, San Francisco, our taxpayers are very generous. They tax themselves. So back in 2012, we did a housing trust fund that generates $50 million annually, and a small part of that funds tenant right to counsel. And then in 2018, there was a tax on the largest businesses in San Francisco that created $250 million for homelessness. And that includes a prevention bucket and that was actually what fully funded our program. So, taxes, general fund, federal, formula funds like CDBG and other programs. I understand the federal government even has like eviction prevention funding opportunities as well. So the funding is out there. And, it's a matter of, we all talk about a budget being a moral document, and we talk about how compelling the tenant right to counsel is in doing right by our tenants. So where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, money shouldn't be an issue.
If I can add from the perspective of the practitioner, so all of that is more important, right? Getting the money for the jobs and for the supportive services is all very important. Within the budget constraints as they exist, I have the perspective of, I'm the, co-chair of the Brooklyn Tenant Lawyers Network, which is the Kings County's network professional association for people that do this type of work. So we talk about pipeline problems all the time, right? And we talk about how do you connect with, 1Ls, how do you get in there in law schools and make the relationships, whether it be through clinics. We're very lucky in the region to have a lot of law schools, New York, New Jersey, and many of them have housing clinics or community development clinics or anti-displacement clinics. And so we have these resources, but it's that networking. And so, we're looking at how do we partner with these clinics? How do we partner with these law schools to bring people in so they can see? Because coming back to things we've all said today, I believe that when law students or fresh law graduates come in and see the work, they see the impact this work has, they work with clients, that is a draw. Now, does that sustain somebody over the course of their post-law school career? Obviously not. We've seen the burnout, we've seen the turnover. But to get those fresh, energized, with already having some level of experience, frankly, is important as we have new attorneys. And so that's definitely a problem that we think about just from the practitioner side, both to sustain our current membership and also to, recruit, for lack of a better term. And so funding really helps that, but just attending to potential partnerships with regional law schools and really getting law students those experiences is also important.
Definitely. John, I saw you were off mic. Did you have anything to add to this question before we turn to some audience questions quickly?
Yeah, just the only thing, I think Ugo and Zach outlined what a lot of people are doing. I think it's worth noting that this problem is, it's basically baked into the system of the way that our law schools work in a lot of ways, and the way that legal services programs have been set up. Like the law schools are not teaching enough about legal, why people should pursue public interest careers, and they don't teach enough about housing as an issue, period. So people don't come out of law school saying, oh yeah, housing justice, that's a career I want to pursue at all. So that's really a big problem, one that we're actually going to be taking a hard look at in the next year. And then even if they do come out, ready to do that career. They have mountains of debt, and legal aid pay combined with mountains of debt is a problem. So there are systemic issues that that are going to be big and not easily changed about pay equity and debt, and programs are thinking and getting creative about offering more loan forgiveness and having fellowships and creating more law school clinics and doing lots of things to try to increase the pipeline. But this problem, is one that's going to take time. It's not going to be solved overnight. And what we say in response to places that are worried about right to counsel because of that is go slow. There's no reason you have to cover everyone immediately. You can have an incremental right to counsel that covers groups of people, as long as it's not like we're going to decide on an individual basis who does and doesn't get counsel. That doesn't work. But if you say we're going to start with families with children, we're going to start with seniors, we're going to start with, veterans, that's fine. That's still a right, and it still builds. And that may be what you need to do in order to meet the pipeline that you have right now, that the attorneys you can get right now.
Thanks, John. And yeah, I really want to highlight that that many, if not most, jurisdictions are phasing in their program. The important pieces are it's established as a right under law, and then there's a process for figuring out how to implement that right, and how to do that implementation equitably, make sure that those most impacted are accessing it, that the neighborhoods that are have the highest eviction rates are getting representation. So. Okay, we have just a few minutes for some audience Q&A. I'm gonna just check in with Maya and Wesley, who have been looking through the chat. And okay, so this question can be for all three of you. How do you balance being prospective in your approach to solving housing and tenant issues versus being inclusive of the individual perspectives who are experiencing this phenomenon? And I give that question to either all of you.
I'm sorry, can you use, is it how can it be more prescriptive? How can in other words, like more of, I'm still just trying to get my head around it. I'm not sure if Ugo and Zach are ready to answer.
Well, this is central to any question of kind of reflexive policy making, taking in community input, centering affected communities, while also wanting to pass a law or pass a policy that has particulars that laws and policy need, like just certain framings and things. So there's a role for those that are leading organizations for advocacy and in offices actually drafting policy. That is a role of listening, first listening, soliciting information, and trying to translate so that prescriptive aspect takes a back seat. And if anything, it's more in an educational way. Like, here's what we've seen in other communities. We've seen that this kind of approach can have this effect. And if you can center testimonials from other communities, right? This is a thing. Here's what tenants in the Bronx are saying about how right to counsel has helped them, right? It's not just a chart. Charts are very important, right? Both for policymakers and for communities to look at. But it's not about just saying, here's what the data and the research shows works, and now you should think that that's what you need. But instead, it's what are your conditions? What are your problems? What are your goals? Here are some things that we have been seeing work. And it's a reflexive and conversational process so that you're not being prescriptive. Because I think that it's not versus being inclusive, it has to be inclusive. If it comes to being a battle between being inclusive and being prescriptive, inclusive of the affected communities is always the top, in my opinion, and in what's been successful in many movements, that is the first. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. Sometimes, and we're fortunate in my organization that we're a largely reactive organization responding to community concerns. We're not coming into a city and saying, okay, you need to pass right to counsel and here's how you do it. They're coming to us and saying, we want to do this. How do we accomplish it? But even in the work we do, when we're working with communities, we see often that there will be certain stakeholders with more power who will come and say, like, okay, this is what needs to happen. And the community may not have been consulted about that. And that may even include what housing issues they consider our priority right now. They may say, look, right to counsel is not the thing we need to be working on at this moment. It's just cause, or it's we want, a rental registry. We want inspections. We want something else. So if that's the answer, then that's the answer. If the community that is those people who are battling with these issues said this is the priority right now, then that should be the priority. Because they are the ones who are the affected community, even if other people have other ideas. And I think, as Zach was saying, the case can be made to them to say, look, there is a window of opportunity right now. There's interest in the council. There's funding. Are you sure that you don't want this issue to go forward right now? Because we see this chance. But if they say, look, it's just not what we want to do right now, well, we're not the ones to tell them that they're wrong. That would not be a wise approach in any book.
Thanks, John and Zach. And we have time for just one more question. And it's a question that I get asked often, which is whether right to counsel laws guarantee representation to people without documentation. I can answer the question that, of course, it will depend on the jurisdiction and the exact law, but I think all, if not all, of existing laws and funding cover tenants regardless of their immigration status. But I'm also curious to hear from our panelists on what jurisdictions are doing to make sure that all immigrants are getting access and are accessing the program, both in terms of eligibility, but also just in getting connected to attorneys.
I could just quickly say, yeah, you're correct that none of the laws have immigration status as part of the law. It's everyone. There may be other eligibility like income or other things, but not immigration status. The way it comes up is that if there is a provider who is unable to provide assistance because the LSC, the Legal Services Corporation rules prevent them from providing assistance to someone who's undocumented, then that case would simply go to another organization or contracted out to a private attorney or otherwise handled. But those cases are not being excluded from the right to counsel space. As far as that said, there is tremendous fear in the immigrant community about using any benefits programs, no matter how much they're made available to the general community. And I think that when it comes to getting people to use right to counsel, there are a lot of barriers to it, not just with immigrants, but a lot of tenants have seen a broken system for a long time and have become convinced that nothing will change it, even representation. Or they may think, as landlords often repeat, this is just a quote non-payment case. So what can an attorney do if I didn't pay? And the answer is it's far, far more complicated than that, which we don't have time to get into. But basically, so whether it's immigrants or non-immigrants, reaching out to those communities and doing know your rights presentations and also impact of representation and understanding what a lawyer can actually do is critical part of the outreach that happens after the program goes into effect.
Yes, definitely. That education and connecting with impacted communities so they can really understand what is available and weigh those risks for themselves and be informed is so important. So given time, I'm going to wrap this up. But thank you again, Zach, John, Ugo. We really appreciate your sharing your insights and experience. And I encourage everyone to reach out to our panelists after this event to learn more from them. And I'll turn now to Wesley.
Thanks. Yes, sadly, that is our time for today. It's a huge concept to try to unpack in just a little over an hour. So hopefully this has been a helpful piece of ongoing conversations you all will continue to have. A quick reminder, we'll post a link to the recording along with a summary and other key resources once it's available. And check out the Change Lab website, newsletter, and social media for our forthcoming Right to Counsel primer for public health professionals. As Shaniqua noted in the beginning, we hope you'll join us for the final session in our series, a panel on building capacity for equitable implementation of housing policies. Again, we'll share more info and the registration link through our website, newsletter, and social media, so stay tuned. And please stay in touch. Here is our contact information and the contact information of our wonderfully knowledgeable panelists who were kind to share So thank you again, Ugo, John, and Zach, and thank you to everyone in the audience for attending and your thoughtful questions. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon.